Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Nick and Joe show. I'm Nick, he's Joseph, and we have quite the show lined up for you tonight. There is all kinds of news in the news to discuss, and I hope you'll stay with us. We have, let's just say it's going to be an interesting show. There's a story by Rebel News and the Globe is carrying that we're going to get into. We're going to talk a little bit about, the COVID-19 vaccine and how they're beginning to make rumblings about those without it, who refuse vaccination may suffer penalties, or you're going to need the vaccination to work in certain fields. And I think this is the slippery slope. So there's that. We have Christina Freeland, our finance minister Freeland, is saying, basically, you save too much money, and we want to put that back into the economy. We want to unlock that massive sea of money that people have squirreled away during COVID, because there was nothing else to do anyway, and we want to stimulate the economy. So Joseph and I we're going to go over that for you. And there also is a story out of the States concerning the ongoing saga that has come out of the U.S. presidential elections. So there's a lot to get into, but I simply have to start with this one, if I can just bring it up real fast. Okay, basically what it is Ezra Levant broke a story today, and I wanted to make sure I was right about this. So I looked it over, I watched the video, and now it's being carried by the same story is being carried by the Globe and Mail. So that gives us even more credibility than before. And when I tell you what the story's about, there's two possibilities here. And on one hand, it might be a poison pill released by the government to discredit rebel media. Now, the problem I have with that particular point of view is that if you don't care about rebel media yesterday, why do you care about it today? Like, in other words, the government never pays rebel any attention anyway. Won't talk to its reporters, has no interest in, letting them do their job as far as being a news agency covering the government. They just, for all intents and purposes, the federal government that we have now under our glorious leader has no interest in talking to or even acknowledging rebel media. So why the discrediting program, if that is in fact the case? Another possibility is the documents released in this report were given to rebel because somebody inside the government might have had a conscience and wanted this story to get out, and they knew that the only news outlet in the country that would actually pick it up and run with it was rebel. So those are the two most practical ones. Oh, okay. So Joseph is back. He was working on a little bit of a technical issue in the background, so I was just rambling on. So Joseph, let's start with this. You've had a chance to at least have a glance at this document.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it, Nick, to be perfectly honest with you. It's a long, somewhat unusually long accessed information. But as we were talking about earlier, and as you just mentioned, the Globe and Mail is running with the story now as well. So I think it's for real. It appears that the that's very good. I can hear your dog breathing all over you there, Nick.
That's me scratching at my pad.
So anyway, it appears to be a real story, and we're not talking about the Chinese having sent over a large number of troops for cold weather training. We're not talking. I mean, we're talking about a handful of troops. I'm not entirely certain how exactly how many, but I think the number that I saw somewhere was fewer than a dozen, actually, which which leads me to ask what their ranks were, how senior they were, because it seems to me to be a waste to send over, 6 or 7 or 8 of your lowest rank infantrymen to train for cold weather. But this opens up a whole range of questions, not just we'll get in for a second. In a second or two, Nick, we can get into the whether or not this is a wise policy on the part of the government. And as you said or asked, what the hell are these guys thinking by allowing this to happen? But my first question, two of my questions that come up immediately, have nothing to do with affixing blame or anything like that. They're really more technical questions. The first being, why would the Chinese have to send anyone to Canada for cold weather training? China, of course, has its own cold weather. That's the start for starters. And the second question being, if you want to do cold weather training in Canada, Petawawa is not really the place to do it. You'd want to do it, I would probably say, in the dead of winter, probably in one of the bases in Alberta, or there's nothing stopping you from doing some exercise right up north in the Arctic. So this actually leads me, Nick, to think that there's in fact more than just the cold weather training involved. Sorry, go ahead.
We're both doing, Joseph, and I'm meant to do that in the preamble, and I didn't. Was tell people what this documentation is.
Okay, so I missed that. Sorry, Nick.
And where it comes from. Yeah, no, that's okay. I should have done that right away. This documentation comes from the Department of Defense, or the Ministry of Defense, and it was in basically when I was watching Ezra Levant explain this, he asked a simple question. He'd noticed a headline on a Russian propaganda website called Sputnik, and it mentioned that there were about 65 nations showed up last April to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Navy. Now, there were a lot of people, a lot of countries you would expect, like Russia, and a lot of Chinese satellites and things like that. But it mentioned Canada. So he sent a request off to the Department of Defense, or I keep calling it the Department of Defense, Ministry of Defense, asking if Canadian troops had actually participated in these particular ceremonies.
Right, and access to information.
And that was the only question he wanted. What's that?
Through
that access to information.
Correct.
That's right. That's what he did. He put together. He waited 19 weeks to get his answer, but when he got an answer, he got 34 pages back, confirming the presence of Canadian troops or military personnel at this propaganda event by the Chinese government, which is what those things are. It's the naval version of a military parade on Red Square. So they were there. Then you have the story, and when he started to dig into these documents, he found all kinds of other things about the training at CFB Petawawa with cold weather. And what's his name? Chief of Defense Staff Vance, General Vance, put a stop to it. And basically, the government went crazy. They were afraid that China was going to lose face. They didn't want to embarrass China. And all of this kind of things going on. And when Ezra's talking about it, he's saying that that's not what I asked for, but boy, did they ever send me the mother load. But of all the scandals and bombshells in it, this is the biggest one. We are training, and it's not just at Petawawa. There were training going on at a Canadian Forces College in Toronto, at RMC in Kingston, the Royal Military College in Kingston, where you have 1- and 2-star Chinese generals participating and taking notes on how we train our officers. Well, that's like Britain inviting in the German military just before World War II, asking about, so how do you train these men? You don't do that. China is a lot of things, but our friend is not one of them. And on top of the one thing Ezra kept coming back to, and I know I'm hoarding the time, but I'm just trying to lay the table here, was how through it all, they mention that the whole thing centered around the arrest of this woman called Meng out in Vancouver, a legal arrest based on a request by the Americans, who was wanted for bank fraud and is living a high life in Vancouver. And shortly after that, 2 Canadians get, he used the term kidnapped. I thought they were already prisoners. But bottom line was, these 2 Canadians are over in China, and they're not even mentioned. They're called consular issues. They don't even mention I can't remember the last name, so we'll call them the 2 Mikes. It goes on and on and on. And when I'm watching this, and I'm getting more and more outraged by the whole thing, because look, it's one thing if it's just one news media, maybe they were led astray, but now you've got 2. One is a national, highly recognized news media, and the other one has its core, the people who believe it, lots of them. They're not the National Post, I'm referring to Rebel, of course, but they've done some interesting work in the past. And I have a couple other sources I checked with, people who are in the know, and while they couldn't confirm the story was true, they found it very, very likely that it was true. So when you put it all together, this is really beginning to look like a real story.
Well, I think it's a real story for sure, and you've summarized the background to it quite well and quite succinctly, Nick, and so I appreciate you doing that. I thought you had already done it. But I want to go back to the thing that raises the biggest suspicions for me, and that is, if you're going to do cold weather exercises, there are 2 things that jump out immediately. Okay, the first being that I don't think that Petawawa. There are 3 things. First of all, I don't think that Petawawa in Canada is probably the best place to do it. And in fact, when we do extreme weather exercises here in Canada, we don't do them with our own troops in Petawawa. We do exercises in the far north and in different places where the terrain and the conditions, the environment and the climate are going to be far more extreme than they are, quite frankly, in Petawawa, which is, just an hour and a half between an hour and a half and 2 hours down the road here from Ottawa, where I'm coming from in the studio. So that's the first thing. Petawawa is not the first country that comes to mind, in my view, when you're talking about cold weather exercises. The second thing is, if you're doing exercises, why would you do them with 6 or 7 or 8 individuals? And you simply wouldn't do it. You'd want to send over a real operational unit. Could be even as small as a platoon. Although I think that would be a waste. But you'd want to send over a company or even a regiment or whatever. But to send over 6 or 7 people, that just makes no sense at all to me. And finally, China doesn't have to send troops to Canada for cold weather training. In fact, there are many places in China where the People's Liberation Army are going to get proper training, a proper environment in that, and in fact, not only cold weather training, but harsh environment up in the mountains in the Himalayas, which is going to give you cold and everything. So I got to tell you, having laid all of that, what this smells like to me, Nick, this smells to me like an espionage exercise. That's what it smells like to me.
Yeah, and I think you're again, and I'm going to back up what you're saying. You send a handful, 6 to 8 troops to Petawawa. That is such a small crowd. First of all, it can blend in and no one would